Beyond Eden's Gate, the legacy of the Oregon Trail, is a special presentation of KPTV 12, produced in cooperation with the Oregon Trail Coordinating Council and the Oregon Historical Society.
You might think that this muddy road is all that remains of the pioneers' great migration west 150 years ago. But the Oregon Trail is more than just a path carved in the wilderness. Popular culture just won't let us forget it. Tales of the emigrant's journey are chronicled in countless books, movies, and songs, all hearkening back a nostalgic portrait. And while history tells us there was no average Oregon Trail experience, the route did come to be symbolic, representing the course of a growing nation in search of its own Eden. Tonight, with the help of pictures and voices depicting the past, we bring you the story of how this phenomenal emigration shaped the West as we look beyond Eden's Gate, the legacy of the Oregon Trail.
A box full of ribbons, a toy soldier's drum, and the old sheriff mammoth, she rocked in the sun. Oh, the cradle abandoned is still on my mind. I'm afraid I'm still missing what we left behind.
In a 20-year period, from 1840 to 1860, more than 50,000 overland travelers set out for Oregon, leaving behind all that was familiar to them. Their specific reasons for making the journey west varied, but most shared a common ideal, that the fabled Oregon land would be a place where their dreams of a better life could come true.
Certainly this region had a lot of attraction to it. It had a generally peaceful native population. It had tremendous resources of fertile soil, healthy climate, stands of timber, fish. It was an attractive land. It beckoned alluringly to a generation that was interested in land and resource development. When they knew that there was good authority, such as the reports of Wilkes and Fremont and Slocum and Lewis and Clark and others about the potentials of this region, there was hardly any holding them back.
I'm on my way, to a higher ground, to a better world than I've ever found. I've got my reasons for leaving this town, boy. So long, Marv, Oregon bound. Hey, head 'em out!
As the numbers of those Oregon bound grew steadily in the 1840s, those traveling the trail found that they were hardly alone.
But I think one of the most compelling misconceptions about all of this is that they went through, as some phrased it, a howling wilderness. This was a land that had been occupied by human beings for 10,000 years or more.
The company along the trail could not change the time it took to travel it. The route measured around 2,000 miles from Independence to Oregon. On a good day, the pace to push for was a brisk 2 miles per hour. Many immigrants ended up walking the entire route, following trusted teams and overloaded wagons. While the trip today could take about a week by car, back then immigrants spent anywhere from 4.5 to 6.5 months following the trail. Some described it in exacting detail, the tribulations and travails they had to endure.
A man must be able to endure heat like a salamander, mud and water like a muskrat, dust like a toad, and labor like a jackass. He must learn to eat with his unwashed fingers, drink out of the same vessel with his mules, sleep on the ground when it rains, and share his blanket with vermin. He must cease to think, except as to where he may find grass and water and a good camping place. It is a hardship without glory, to be sick without a home, to die and be buried like a dog.
Some settlers left less descriptive mementos, simple names, places, and dates carved in this Nebraska cliff.
The first immigrants started putting their initials, letting people know that they had been here and where they were from.
Others left more personal marks, indications their trip had at least some personal historical significance.
For the first time, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people wrote diaries to record their Western travel experiences. That was remarkable, because most of those people, neither before nor after, ever kept a diary. So they had a sense that, at least in terms of their overland travel, this was a unique experience.
But little did these immigrants know of the legacy of their journey. Their actions would impact everything from the early government of the region the future of its native people.
They started feeling the pressure, I think, and this is why they started, things started erupting, really.
And the character of the land. The trail had a lasting impact on individuals and families for generations.
And the mother said, if only I had let our boys learn how to swim. I'll tell you something. My children learned how to swim very early.
And its economic potential is still being explored today.
This is the orientation gallery. This is the eye catcher, the grabber that tells people we've got a big story to tell about crossing big country with small wagons and tough people.
Henry David Thoreau helped distinguish this era with the phrase, "We go westward, as into the future, with a spirit of enterprise and adventure." That spirit helped those who persevered to journey's end, to that much-anticipated land of Oregon, otherwise known as Eden's Gate.
Today my mind was so distracted by dust I have no idea how far we came. There are 9 wagons ahead of us, each with 5 yoke of oxen, dragging their feet in the dust and blowing it in the air. The air was so full of it, our own oxen were completely obscured.
We soon find a suitable place, camp, and another is added to our number. Mrs. Hutchinson has a fine boy. We name it Sandy, and when it was baptized, it bore the name of Sandy. We only stop here one day. The woman is made as comfortable as possible, and we proceed on our journey.
Last night, we spread a shawl on the ground, spread another over us, and put the dogs on top. Tyler, Tracker, Barney, and Little Cash. It was the coldest night you ever saw, and if it hadn't been for the dogs, we would have frozen.
The boys amused themselves by killing prairie squirrels, as they call them. I am firm in the belief that they are rats. I protested against cooking rats, but fresh meat is so scarce they had to be fixed. It's the pronounced opinion that they look too much like rats and taste too much like fish to ever become popular.
Life on the Oregon Trail, as described in many a pioneer recollection, leaned toward the superlatives: the best water, the strongest winds, the tallest trees, the grandest scenery. This larger-than-life picture of the West beckoned to a sizable group of overland travelers in 1843, counting about 1,000 immigrants in all. Their journey would become known as the Great Migration, and among its ranks were 3 brothers from Missouri: Charles, Jesse, and Lindsay Applegate.
They are really a good example of what was happening in the mid-19th century, where families like the Richardsons, the Belknaps, my wife's family, the Coxes, the Applegates, immigrated not as nuclear units, but as extended kin groups.
The Applegate clan was close in part because 2 of the 3 brothers married 2 sisters. In all, 32 Applegate relatives and friends decided to make the journey together. Descendant Shannon Applegate describes one theory as to why her relatives left behind their well-established farms.
They were feeling pretty disgusted with the economic picture of the times. And so, while it is true that they had wonderful farms along the Osage River and were quite well-to-do, They were struggling against a system that they felt was depleting them of their capital.
Because of their resources and exhaustive planning, the Applegates were among those well outfitted for the journey. Each of the Applegate men could afford several wagons at a hefty investment of $3,000 to $5,000 apiece. A great deal of supplies were also taken in order to sustain them for months at a time.
It was necessary to have sufficient supplies, probably 120 pounds of flour per person, a fair amount of dried fruit, particularly peaches and apricots. Some carried pickles and sauerkraut, trying to diversify their diet and stave off ravages of things like scurvy.
While some may have believed they would find the West uninhabited, activity there had been picking up pace for some time. In fact, those now living at Journey's End were already organizing, setting the stage for an early government. John Meek's great-grandfather, Joe, was one of those already there.
The free enterprise system, really wasn't in place, and these people wanted freedom. They wanted that independence, and eventually they called the ultimate wolf meeting, and that was down at Champoeg on May 2nd, 1843.
When the votes were counted, the so-called American Party prevailed by a narrow margin, and thus the beginnings of an independent Oregon.
As an interesting footnote to Western history, Joe Meek and others made a decision to form a provisional government at Champoeg. In the larger diplomatic history of the United States, those events perhaps are quite bracketed or are a mere footnote to what was going on in terms of resolving the Oregon question.
Back on the trail, some overland travelers had little energy to ponder the question of Oregon, dealing instead with more immediate problems of their own.
Although our teams have not got what may be called heavy loads, it appears to be difficult for all to get along. Consequently, we left one of our wagons, 2 boxes of valuable books, trunks, chairs, etc., worth at least $300. This is a sad destruction, but it cannot be avoided.
Lightening the load was the least of some overlanders' troubles. While many made the journey with relatively few hardships, some fell sick and died.
Counted as many as 500 graves along the North Platte. Cholera lasted usually but a day. Many with beds and blankets were abandoned by the roadside, and no man dared touch them for fear of the unknown, unseen destroyer.
Disease was by far the #1 killer on the trail, accounting for nearly 9 out of every 10 deaths.
One of the biggest problems, however, was personal hygiene and the impact both of dysentery as well as the cholera.
Accidents were also common, with river crossings being especially treacherous for some.
I've come about 12 miles today and arrived at the second crossing of the Snake River. It's 2 weeks today since we crossed it first, and a sorrowful time it's been to us. We've lost 8 head of our work cattle and 1 yearling.
When we left the story of the close-knit Applegate clan, they were just beginning their journey in the spring of 1843. But by late October, the group, progressing well ahead of schedule, was to encounter a tragedy of their own, one that would impact generations of their family. Although not a superstitious group, they had taken note of a raven flying above their camp near the Columbia River, and some felt it an ominous sign about the unusual route they were taking.
Whitman and Robert Shortis advised the family that they would be wise to use the river as a road, that would make an easier way to come into the country. They had a good reason in the family for wanting to make the trip a little less rough. 2 of the 3 Applegate wives were pregnant and were almost to term.
All seemed to be going smoothly for the caravan of homemade boats on the Columbia River until the little skiff ran into trouble.
There were some rapids that were visible, but it was the whirlpool that got the little boat. And this great swirling maw, like a mouth opening in the water, sucked the little boat down. And when the boat came back up, and this is an eerie image, that several family members have talked about, the boat was empty of everyone.
A few from the skiff made it ashore, like young Elijah Applegate, who had learned to swim against his mother's wishes. But several drowned, among them 2 young Applegate boys who couldn't be rescued.
Lindsay stood up in the boat, and then all of the women in the boat said to him, "Men, men, do not quit the oars, you cannot save those boys." And of course they couldn't. There was an incredible cohesion.
Later in the program, some of the Applegate descendants will share with you their story of how something positive came of this tragedy. Incidents like these were far from typical for overland travelers, yet generations still live with personal sorrows from the journey west. An average of 1 grave sits every 80 yards along the Oregon Trail.
When death has come and taken our loved ones, it leaves our home so lonely and drear. Then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year? Farther along we'll know all about it. Farther along we'll understand why. So cheer up, my brother, live in the sunshine, 'cause we'll understand it all by and by. We'll understand it all by and by.
The first time there were just a few, but the next year there were more. And the next year they flowed like a river to the sea. They waste the buffalo and strip the deep grass and give us old shirts and new sickness. I see in their eyes a hunger like never before. For your sake, I hope the whites come to understand that all in this land, the crow, the rain, the rivers, and the moon, are a part of us, like the veins in our bodies, like the blood in our veins, like the trails that run from our hearts. It is our nature. It is all one.
For thousands of years, the native peoples achieved a balance with nature. The human experience belonged only to them. It was their religion, their culture, their history. And in their world, no one held claim to the land.
Well, actually, no one really owned the land. Our belief is that the land owns us, you know, because we are a part of the land.
Among the first to interrupt this balance were early trappers and traders and missionaries, followed by immigrants traveling the Oregon Trail. For the Native Americans, the Great Migration hardly conjured up nostalgic images. The Oregon Trail has been described instead as a great serpent twisting and turning across the land.
They interrupted our way of life because we had lived with nature, I mean the land, and everything that we got and everything that we believe in comes from the land. I mean,
And so this is where they interrupted and they just sort of took away.
What native peoples were thinking as they watched this grand procession is difficult to imagine, since there is no written legacy. What's been left behind are stories, an oral tradition, passed down from generations. One tale illustrates an early compassion for the immigrants.
I like to tell the story. My mother told me that she got from her father, whose name was Kipsuts-Piaoyan, which meant wounded claw. When he was a young boy, they saw the wagon trains, and he said at first the Indians concealed themselves and didn't make themselves known to the immigrants, and that they thought the oxen were very unusual and very strange. They had never seen an animal like this. They felt very sorry for the children because they were very ragged and tattered and were barefoot. And the people, the adults, looked very, very tired and haggard. And so they felt sorry for them.
The Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation hope to preserve their history along with their cultural heritage by building their own Oregon Trail Interpretive Center. Tribal elders want to preserve information about such things as traditional foods.
This here is what we dig in the springtime, and it's in dried form, and it's called biscuit root, and we call it hausch.
And the meaning of handmade garments.
I want to pass on to the children the stories of the country, and so it won't be forgot. And if we teach them now, while their mind is still young, to know the significance of outfits, regalia, that we know it won't go in our time. It'll go on a little further.
Stories relating to the Oregon Trail are still passed along, like this one a grandfather told about learning English words.
Every wagon train that came along, they asked, "How far Willamette?" Well, no one knew what they were talking about, but this was the English they remembered, "How far Willamette?" And so a young man was curious, and so he followed a wagon train on horseback. And no one knows how far he followed it or whether he found Willamette. But he came back later with a gunny sack full of chickens, domesticated chickens. And these were the first domestic chickens brought to this area.
Early immigrants wrote about their interactions with Native Americans, writings that contradict the widely disseminated myth of incessant warfare between the peoples.
On the whole, the diaries confirm that there were numerous positive relationships between Native Americans and overland travelers.
These relationships included tales of Native Americans helping warn of dangers ahead, providing guide services, and trading goods.
This morning we started early for Fort Boise, and on our way about 100 Indians and squaws met us on their ponies. We were somewhat frightened at first, but we soon found that they were friendly and had potatoes and peas at the fort to sell. I sold one of my dresses to an Indian for $1, and we swapped some of the baby's clothes for some peas.
Still, stories of danger were spread by overland travelers.
Some of the immigrants in the initial part of the journey, however, filled their evenings and nights with imagined dangers. The Indian was a psychological foe. And the creation of that may well have been the captivity narratives, of which there were over 300 such books published by 1850, that had presented the Indian as a formidable obstacle to frontier advance.
Eventually, confrontations took place.
It is erroneous to view the American Indian as having taken vast numbers of lives of overland immigrants. To be sure, there were some conflicts and there were some deaths, but those deaths were on both sides. Immigrants murdered Indians, and occasionally Indians murdered immigrants.
The overlanders' impact on the Native American population was often catastrophic. Severely contagious diseases were spread among the tribes by the immigrant passage. Overlanders' fears prompted trailside forts and army patrols in some areas, and prejudices were fostered by those with attitudes of blatant superiority. For the Native American way of life, the opening of the route across the West translated into disruption, dislocation, and sometimes death.
Tribes were dispossessed. Tribes were shoved out of traditional villages. The hunting and fishing of tribes opportunities were depleted, and soon the pressure for land was felt. And by the mid-1850s, the tribes on the Columbia Plateau had been summoned to treaty councils to cede their lands to the government of the United States. That was part of the inexorable impact of overland immigration.
Why are we still here today? We are here today not because I myself, but because of our forefathers, because they had a strength that helped them survive, which was a religious philosophy and knowing how to live with nature.
In 1855, a Cayuse named the Young Chief said, "The Great Spirit put people on earth, desired them to take good care of the ground and to do each other no harm." While the mark of the Oregon Trail remains, so do these age-old Native American cadences, echoing in thoughts, actions, and words that depict what was and what could have been.
Look, the sun comes up. Let's sing to it. All right. I will sing and you cry. It is said that for men and wolves, crying and singing are the same thing. Hear me, not for myself, but for my people. Hear me in my sorrow, and for my son. Hear me that they may once more go back into the sacred hoop and find the good red road. Oh, make my people live. Make my people live forever, forever. Akichinata awanu manu ohini meksu ay.
There's a garden God is tending, where the fields are green and deep, with a harvest never ending there by waters cool and sweet. There a man can lay his burdens down, there a man can live in grace. Oh, I hope I see before I die the land at Eden's gate.
The scenery along the Oregon Trail was so wondrous that for some immigrants it was almost indescribable. In fact, one diarist stated, "No written words could ever characterize the magnificence of the West, and anyone who tried would only make a fool of himself."
Well, it's interesting to read the accounts of people in the 19th century. They refer to the seemingly inexhaustible supply of timber. They refer to streams that are so choke-filled with salmon that one could almost walk across the stream dry-shod on the backs of the fish during the spawning runs. There was little sense that they were dealing with what were potentially finite resources.
Many also wrote about the natural wonders along the way. The sandstone tower of Chimney Rock, the tranquil Platte River passing by Scotts Bluff, and the chiseled Columbia River Gorge. Even as their wagons passed by the sites along the Oregon Trail, the emigrants began to make their own marks on the land.
Thousands of wagons and several tens of thousands of livestock crossed the Oregon Trail. Earth is fairly fragile. The wagons had iron-rimmed hubs. They cut or grooved the earth, and they left rather indelible marks on it.
Because emigrants often traveled side by side over valleys and plains, the trail sports no single set of parallel ruts. Wagon scars can still be found, the most common being deep trenches in locations that demanded single-file travel.
These are some of the nicer ruts on the Barlow Road. They're well defined, they're very deep. I suppose they're close to 4 feet deep through here. As the wagons came up through the soft ground, they would expose more rocks with each passage, and the travelers would just pitch the rocks off to the side. And now we end up with walls of rock along both sides of the ruts.
Today, efforts are being made to preserve what remains of the Oregon Trail.
Right now we're on the original Oregon Trail. And the Forest Service is maintaining it pretty much like you see it, like we're driving over today. It's rough and it's muddy. We've put in some drainage structures to keep it from totally washing out. It's a slow speed drive, meandering through the woods.
To keep track of the trail for future generations, signs are being made to mark portions of it.
We were given the responsibility for developing themes and images and text based on the quotations, using as much of the quotations as possible for these various sites along the Oregon Trail.
Even though early immigrants had maps and guidebooks available to help them follow the trail, many still had misconceptions about the geography of the Northwest.
Finally, someone in our party asked about the size of Oregon City and how far it was to that place. He told us, "You immigrants seem to think that Oregon City is the only town in Oregon. Why, there's Portland. That's about 12 miles below, which is twice the size of Oregon City and does 10 times the business. You fellers must be a set of damned ignoramuses to think that Oregon City is the only town in Oregon." We readily came to the conclusion that we were somewhat ignorant concerning the geography of the great Northwest and asked no more questions.
Of course, the promise of owning a piece of this geography was one of the area's first draws, as early immigrants hoped to stake new land claims.
When that law finally passed in 1850 and offered 320 acres to women as well as men, it served as a tremendous magnet to draw even more settlers.
One group already having made the journey was the Applegate clan. Remember the tragedy that befell them along the Columbia River? After settling in Oregon, some family members blazed an offshoot of the Oregon Trail so others might find an easier passage.
That was the motivation, was to avoid the hardships of the crossing of Columbia, and the Applegate Trail came about because of an easier route. That was the whole point of the thing.
Interstate 5 in southern Oregon now runs along much of the Applegate Trail. Some of what grows today at the end of the Oregon Trail is quite different from what immigrants saw thriving here 150 years ago. In fact, these pioneers played a part in transforming the land's bounty.
They brought Scotch broom, Russian olive, thistles, foxglove, cheatgrass, Himalaya blackberries. There were a number of specimens that they introduced that began to change the flora.
The Garden of the World. That's what some overlanders had called the Promised Land of Oregon. To reach this place had taken energy, courage, and cooperation. Now many immigrants look forward to the day when the region could claim its distinctions and begin to blossom.
Today we set foot in Oregon territory, the land of promise. As of yet, it only promises an increased supply of sagebrush and sand.
Oh, I hope I see before I die the land at Eden's gate.
It was after dark when we came to the camping place where Uncle Sam had a campfire built. Everyone was tired. Some of us were cross and wet, went to sleep immediately. Not until the next morning did we discover that the fire had been built on a grave. No one bothered to move it. I've mentioned our growing indifference and what we must endure each day is robbing us of all sentiment. It is to be hoped that we will not be permanently changed.
Many Oregon Trail travelers shared the sentiment that the journey was one they'd never choose to repeat. Yet with the coming of gold fever, the number of overland travelers grew, and so did the presence of the federal government along the route. Various forts were built along the trail, and soldiers were dispatched in hopes of making the pioneers' journey easier.
The fort was established in 1849 as a military post to protect the immigrants as they were journeying west. Little did they know they didn't actually need that much protection from the Indians.
In 1849, the U.S. government attempted to establish a military post to protect immigrants on the trail, and that was Camp Loring. It lasted one winter. The Army entailment that came out didn't like Idaho winters, and they abandoned the fort by May of the next year.
Government efforts did lead the way to some improvements in communications and transportation, providing an easier passage for future travelers.
The development of the steam locomotive and the impact of the steamboat and the development of the telegraph suggested that a transcontinental United States was a possibility, that trade, transportation, and communication were now within the realm of technological feasibility. Those events helped drive the sentiment coined by 1844, 1845 about manifest destiny, that it was manifestly destined that the United States might spread from sea to sea.
The growing expanse of the West attracted private entrepreneurs who saw the thousands of immigrants as a means to quick financial gain. Travelers often had to buy or trade for additional supplies along the way, prompting tensions between immigrants and the trailside entrepreneurs, some of whom took advantage of their needy customers.
This is one of the last stopping places they could get their supplies, and if they need be, you know, wagons and horses and all of that. Most of them had to, when they hit here, were convinced they had to exchange their wagons for pack outfits. So the guy made a pretty good business.
By 1860, the Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Hall and Fort Boise had closed, replaced by a multitude of stores, hotels, and stagecoach stations. Modern development of the West was clearly in place. By the turn of the next century, the picture of what these overlanders endured had already blurred as silent movies began to tell a story filled with myth and stereotype. But those who've pieced together the route's history have found there was no average Oregon Trail experience. All of what the immigrants endured helped shape the development that was to come. Today's entrepreneurs are rediscovering the route's economic potential. Everything from retail merchandise to reliving the immigrant experience is being sold in the name of the Oregon Trail.
Grab a friend, grab a pole, come on down to the swimming hole. Bring your dog, bring a rope, but don't bring Mama 'cause she'll bring the soap. Yeah, she'll bring the soap. Down at the river. She'll bring the soap. Down at the river. Some are lost, some are delivered. Take your place down at the river.
This trip means to me the representation of the spirit of the American people that we have yet today.
Well, the hardest part was the dust. But other than that, the bumps, so the kids giggled the whole way.
Absolutely wonderful. Understanding by experience what the pioneers went through and what they endured and how much faith it took to do this. It's unbelievable.
Some folks splash, some folks scream, some spend lives swimming upstream. Some just wade, others leap. Some don't think till they're in too deep. Till they're in too deep. Down at the river, in too deep. Down at the river, some are lost, some are delivered. Take your place. Down at the river.
New interpretive centers are being built. Books and music are being written. Even an original musical has been developed, snippets of which we've shared with you in this program. Renewed interest in the route's historical significance has prompted some, like Joe Meek's great-grandson John, who is now a state representative, to share what they know of the era.
Oregon is very important to me, you know, and I think we have a very unique history. We're one of the very few in all of the United States that chose to form our own provisional government. It's a very unique point in the history of the United States. And, you know, it just happened that, you know, when I look back on my family tree, here was this grizzly mountain man by the name of Old Joe Meek. That was very...
Others are spending time trying to find the trail's exact location and remark it. Descriptions of landmarks have been pieced together so they can be restored. The region's tribes are also sharing their perspectives so others will know of the impacts on them.
Well, we still have the Oregon Trail zooming past us every day. It's I-84 now.
When the pageantry of the sesquicentennial is long diminished, the legacy of the Oregon Trail will not likely be forgotten. Structures and landmarks will continue to leave permanent historical markers for the future.
Senator, you go first. Yay!
Bits and pieces of the human experience can still be found in hundreds of diaries that have been preserved. Family stories remain, and research continues, helping to put the trail's impact in context.
We are all inheritors of our past. I think the trick is to make it usable and to try to see it with as much objectivity as possible, realizing fully that the lens through which we look, the voices that we select to hear, are subjective.
The Oregon Trail's legacy is not the story of one voice, one point of view, or one approach. The impacts of the journey on the history of the region and the nation are numerous and significant. Thousands of immigrants made the choice for change some 150 years ago. Today, the West draws a new generation of overland travelers across its modernized trails. Some may share the same spirit as those who came before them, pioneers who gave substance to Thoreau's phrasing, "Eastward I go only by force, but westward I go free."
Box full of ribbons, a toy soldier's drum, and the old chair of Mama's she rocked in the sun. Oh, the cradle abandoned is still on my mind. I'm afraid I'm still missing what we left behind. This table's too heavy, this mirror's been cracked, and the old chest of Grandpa's will just hold us back. Oh, this trail's lined with pieces of